Hi, my name is Margot Popecki, and I'd like to welcome you to our last writing workshop. Today, we will discuss the abstract and discussion sections of your required research paper, which is due by 5 p.m. December 10th, which is reading day. Please contact me to schedule a writing conference anytime before December 1st. You may also contact myself or Dr. Kristen Miller with any questions you may have. We are both happy to help. So let's get started. As you may recall from our first workshop, scientific research articles are intended to convey information, and they're structured by section. So again, today we're going to focus on the abstract, which is a summary of all of these sections, and the discussion, which focuses on the resolution. So the discussion aims to interpret your results, tie your results back to the literature, and answers the knowledge gap that you identified in the introduction. So the discussion really brings your research article full circle. So all semester long, you collected and analyzed the data. And now the question is, what does it mean? Data is the backbone, but does not tell the whole story. It needs to be interpreted. So before we get into the different components of the discussion, I wanted to distinguish the results and discussion sections because they both deal with findings, but in different ways. So the results focus on providing a detailed description of data without interpreting it. So you stay objective here. You display the data in figures and tables and refer to them using in-text citations. There are no references in the results section. In the discussion, your objective is to briefly restate those findings because the majority of that has already been done in the results. You just need to restate them for context and then expand into interpretation because that's your main focus. There are no figures in the discussion, but you will include references. So let's get into the guidelines. So in that first slide, we saw that the discussion takes this pyramid shape. It starts narrow by focusing on your study. What was your research question? What was your hypothesis? And what was the gap in knowledge that your study aimed to address? The discussion then widens out as you begin to interpret your findings. What is their biological significance? You'll then end the discussion very broadly by addressing the research field. What are the broader implications of your study? What is that big picture? So you will write your discussion in the present tense. And again, that main focus is on interpretation. So the discussion interprets your results and conveys why they are important. Tell the story of your data. So when you make these claims or your interpretations, you need to refer to evidence to derive conclusions about what you're studying. So again, use references to justify your interpretation. So references mean previous work. So how do your findings relate to what others have found? And so foremost, you want to address your hypothesis. So at the end of the introduction, you laid out your hypothesis and your research question. So come back to that. Explain whether or not your data support your hypothesis. And so I'd like to emphasize this point here. Data do not prove or disprove a hypothesis. Rather, they add support for or do not provide support for a hypothesis. So to reiterate that, we as scientists seek to find evidence, not proof. A significant result is evidence that supports your hypothesis, not proof. So in this sentence here, the difference between group A and B was significant, proving our hypothesis is correct, is not an accurate statement. This statement could be revised to, there was a significant difference between group A and B, which supports our hypothesis. So over time, if many studies test the same hypothesis and get similar support, then that hypothesis essentially becomes a theory. But it's important to recognize the difference. A hypothesis is really just a step to explain a phenomena. So to account for that uncertainty, we need to use phrases like these results suggest or indicate, there is strong evidence, only if there is strong evidence, and this may represent or show. So you can use these phrases in your writing. So You will want to acknowledge any anomalous data in your discussion. So anomalous data is data that deviates from what you expected. So data without clear trends or statistical significance is still important information to include. You also want to avoid overreaching or overstating your findings. So one example of this is if you are a researcher who studies the effects of a drug treatment in mice. Say you find a significant effect of that drug in the health outcomes of these mice. You could conclude that this treatment actually does have a positive effect, but in mice. In the future, we may test the effects of this drug in humans. But at this time, our data suggests that it's effective in mice, and we want to avoid overstating that because we haven't tested the effects in humans. It's an area for future work, but because we haven't done it yet, we can only make conclusions about what we have evidence for, what our data supports. So this is a key part of being transparent. What did we do and what can we actually say about that? We also want to address limitations. So anticipate the criticisms that readers may have and defend your conclusions against those criticisms. So one way that might look is discussing factors that may have hindered your data collection or an ability to interpret the results. Another thing to point out is that we are all humans doing science. So human error is something that we have to account for as scientists. So when you're discussing limitations in your research paper, human error is not acceptable. Focus more on other aspects of your data collection, experimental design, or results. Lastly, you want to leave readers with the big picture. So at the end, give the big picture implication of your work. Focus on the broader impacts or application of this research and what the future directions are. So just to recap, the discussion takes a pyramid shape from narrow to broad. You start out by restating the objective of your study. So what was the research question or knowledge gap that you aim to address? Explain how your study contributed towards filling that knowledge gap. This is where you start interpreting your results. So briefly, restate your key findings and conclusions. Why are they biologically meaningful? You also want to end by discussing the broader impacts of this study. What remains unknown and what did you learn? I like to think of writing the discussion as building an argument. So your interpretation or conclusions must be based on evidence. This might be specific examples from your results and references, not opinion. So to reiterate, justify your interpretation by integrating your results with previous studies. You may remember from Google Scholar, science stands on the shoulders of giants. So we want to build on what others have done before. Think about, how does my finding align with the finding of another research paper? Taken together, what can we learn from this information? How can we kind of build a better understanding of this phenomena to move the field forward? So normally this workshop would be interactive. So part of learning how to write a discussion is analyzing the discussions of research papers. So look at how authors have structured their arguments and make their conclusions. So I would encourage you to pause the video and read these excerpts to get a better understanding of this. So this is an excerpt from the discussion of Bezerides et al., published in 2007. So read this paragraph to yourself and ask if you can find where their finding was. Where did the authors report their finding in this paragraph? So I would say that this purple first sentence describes their finding. Carotenoid content and red color of male and female elytra were not correlated with body harmonine content. Next, which sentence or sentences interpret their finding? I would say that these two sentences in blue begin to interpret this finding. And one way you can know that is because of this terminology. This suggests. So that is kind of an indicator that these authors are getting into their explanation of this finding. This is what they think is the biological meaning. So lastly, which sentence justifies their explanation? I would say it's this last sentence in green. And so one way I know that is because they included references. This sentence summarizes these references and is used as justification for this interpretation of this finding. So the goal of the discussion is to identify what your results could mean. So let's jump to the Lower and Hall 2018 study with fireflies. So as you may recall, the discussion section is shaped like a pyramid and starts narrow. So this is from the very beginning of the Lower and Hall 2018 article. And so I really like how these authors have started out by reminding the reader of that gap in knowledge, so what they set out to do, and how they restated the approach and objective. That primes the reader towards understanding what they're about to read, what findings they may interpret, and how it fits in with that driving question. So now we move into the middle of the pyramid, and we can see how Lower and Hall apply this formula of stating the finding, interpreting it, and then justifying it. So I'd also like to point out that these authors use subtitles. So we talked about using subtitles in the methods and results sections, and you're also welcome to use them in the discussion section. So here you'll notice that the authors have used this takeaway statement of population structure analysis suggests barriers to gene flow, which again is the topic of this paragraph. So the researchers have provided context at the very beginning. What are they examining? They also included their initial prediction. Therefore, we expected to observe. I'd also like to emphasize that they are including references here. So when they're describing their expectation, they are kind of explaining to the readers that, no, I didn't just come to this explanation out of thin air. I based it off of research. So they're justifying their explanation. And that adds rigor to their study. Then further down, they're restating their finding. Instead, the genome-wide SNP analysis showed a very high average FST of 0.38 among populations. So they elaborated much more on this finding in the results. So if I, as a reader, have questions, I'll go back to the results section. But here, their goal is just to briefly restate that finding and then focus more on interpreting it, which they do next. They also use references to justify that interpretation. So here, where it says finding, that should say interpretation. So these researchers found a surprising result. They noticed that the current paradigm for variation in light color did not hold. So that was their observation. And again, it was unexpected. So they provided alternative explanations that could explain that outcome. So they made some suggestions. It could be screening pigments or environmental factors that account for this. And they also included references to, again, justify this explanation. So they're not just coming up with it out of thin air. It's based in research, evidence. So now the researchers of Bezarides et al. 2007, we're going back to that study, the very end of their paper, discuss future directions and limitations. So first, what is an area for future research that they described? Well, right here, there is also a genetic component to the melanic coloration that should not be overlooked, including a reference here. It would be interesting to perform studies similar to the ones described here with different color morphs of Harmonia. So that is an area that they suggest for future work. There are actually many different color morphs of Harmonia, and that's worth looking into. They also describe limitations. So they're saying here that our study is actually focused on just one color morph. And that's because it was what was local and available to us, but there are actually many other distinct morphs that should be the target of future work. So these authors also, Lower and Hall, 2018 specifically, concluded with the broader impacts and areas for future study. So let's see how they do it. So in this phrase here, they are providing this big kind of overview of what their study found. So they're talking about rejecting that paradigm. So that's finding one. And then major finding two is here. Instead, there is a strong signal of divergent selection in luciferase, non-coding variation, etc. So these are their main findings, their main takeaways. That's how they moved the field forward with their work. They also described an area for future study. So they're saying here that this study they did highlights a need for future work on these mechanisms that determine light color in natural populations. So you can see how these researchers address the same questions. So when you're revising your discussion drafts, one piece of advice is to highlight the following components in your draft. And first of all, see if you can find them. If you can't, it would be important to rework them into your draft before submission. If you notice that maybe I could elaborate on this, provide more details, include a reference, this explanation could use some work, just again, rework that before you submit it. This can really help you identify areas for improvement. So again, just highlight these different components and use it to see what you can improve upon. So now let's switch gears and talk about the abstract. So as you know from your background research, the abstract is often the first thing that scientists will read. And it's really important that their first glimpse of their study is concise and provides key details, because scientists want to know if the paper is relevant to their work, and they get that information from the abstract. So you as a scientist need to be very kind of specific and careful about what information that you provide, because you want it to represent your study. So I like to think of an abstract as just the tip of an iceberg, because your research study is this big kind of piece of ice below the surface, but we only see that tip. So that's the abstract. That's that succinct, kind of distilled down version of your study. It's a summary. And it's very brief. It's only 200 words. So again, you have to be very choosy about what information you decide to convey. What is most important for the readers to know? You also write the abstract last. And this is important because you need to know what your results are and your interpretation of those results to provide that key information in your abstract. So let's look at the abstract guidelines. Each of these points should be included in your abstract. So what broad question or gap in knowledge drove your research? What is the big picture approach you used to answer your research question? What key findings should the reader come away with? What is the broader impact of your research? And I would suggest, to meet the 200-word limit, that you aim to address each of these points in 1 to 2 sentences. So let's look at a modified abstract from Lower and Hall 2018. So you can find each of these components in their abstract. So significance here, methods and approach, key findings, and major conclusions. So notice how these authors kind of stated these key components of their abstract and conveyed it to the readers, how they chose to distill down their research project into this very concise summary. So lastly, to wrap up, we are at a point in the semester where you are probably finishing up your project and writing about it. So during this writing process, if you have any questions, be sure to clarify them with your mentors. I know from my experience that if I feel unsure about something or don't really understand it completely, it can be really hard to write about it. So if you feel like you could use some clarification on the content of your project, don't hesitate to reach out to your mentor and ask them for guidance. This will make the writing process a lot more enjoyable. It may also be helpful to refer to published research articles in your field, and this could guide your writing. So I've given you many examples from evolutionary biology, but if you're in a different discipline, then it may be helpful to look at your discipline-specific research articles and note if they have a certain structure or use stylistic elements that you might want to as well. So you can use these papers as a model for your own writing. You will also want to revise your first draft. So what that might look like is reviewing the paper guidelines. Did I include everything that I'm supposed to? Doing a peer review with other members of your lab who are also in a research course, and receiving mentor feedback. So your mentor knows your subject very well. So it can be helpful to discuss with them what you're writing about, and they can help fill any gaps in your knowledge. Lastly, if you would like help with your writing, please don't hesitate to reach out and schedule a writing conference. I'm again happy to help. So thank you so much for your time and watching this video. I wish you the best of luck with the end of your semester. Again, please reach out with any questions you may have. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.